think like 75% of my questions are scripted, and I think that is because I come in with a topic. I do have my questions that I'm pretty interested in getting answers to, that I hope will have pretty detailed answers to, and I do stick to my script.
Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Justin Brown. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. Today is a different kind of episode and something I think we can have a little fun with. On today's episode, I won't be doing the question asking of the guest. I'm actually going to have our guest today ask some questions of me, and here's why. On this show, we recently hit 100 episodes, and I feel like based on the fact that we run nearly 50 B2B shows and that I now run a podcast about B2B podcasting that's hit 100 episodes, that I may or may not have some takeaways and insights about the B2B podcasting medium. I didn't want to do an episode, though, that was just my 10 takeaways from 100 podcast episodes. Instead, I wanted to have some fun with it and put it to the test. So I brought on Neal Stewart. Neal is a new customer of Motion's and is launching a podcast in his space as we speak. Neal just got his mic. Not sure. I don't think you even have a tripod yet. We presented your strategic plan yesterday afternoon. I feel like I just saw you. And, you know, I'm sure at this point he has 100 questions and ideas rattling around as he thinks through what he needs to do for his podcast. So I thought, what better way to put the 100 episodes of knowledge to the test than to bring someone on who's going through all of this right now. So on today's episode, Neal will kind of put me on the hot seat. He's prepared a list of questions that I haven't seen yet, and he's going to fire them off at me. I may be able to answer some, all, or none of them. We'll see. So without further ado, Neal, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. This is so meta. It's a B2B podcast about B2B podcasting.
Yeah, I know. And then on top of it, doing a weird version of podcasting where the host is the guest and the guest is the host, and you've never done a podcast for your podcast. And so it should be interesting. I'm excited to see what you prepared, and hopefully we can have, a little bit of a free-flowing conversation. Feel free to bring in anything that you're going through with Holland and that you're thinking about, and we can see where this episode goes.
Yeah, no, I'm excited about it. I've got 13 questions sitting in front of me. I've been working on this for about a week. When one pops in my head, I would type it. So I'm kind of in the process of reacquainting myself with the questions as we speak. But ready to jump in when you are.
All right, I'm ready. Let's see what you got.
I'm going to jump in with a fun one here because a lot of my questions are about interviewing. I think that's probably the biggest doubt that I have about myself is how good of an interviewer am I? I am a person who often feels a little bit awkward when there's a pause. I tend to fill the spaces. So I want to be a good interviewer as I launch this podcast. But I'm a big Howard Stern fan. All right. I love the interviews that he provides on his show. And I read something interesting about him that he knows that he interrupts his guests quite a bit, and he kind of hates that about himself. But he also said that it's necessary sometimes, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting thing. And just so you know, I grew up in the DC area. Howard Stern got his start originally on DC 101 here. I'm a radio guy. That's where I started my career. So Howard Stern has always been like the gold standard of interviewing. So I know Howard Stern pretty well in his interview approach. What I would say to that question is, when it comes to your guests, a lot of times when you ask them a question, they don't know what the expectation is for them. And the best example of this that I use is the question about someone's background. a lot of B2B podcasts start with the background question, which is, hey, Neal, tell the audience a little bit about yourself and what you do. And then Neal goes on, not you, Neal, this proverbial Neal that doesn't exist, but this Neal goes on and says, this is what I do. I work at Holland. Here's my background. Here's where I started my career, blah, 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 blah. And then you go for 10 to 15 minutes. And I, the host, am like, oh my goodness, like I'm going to fall asleep. And if I'm going to fall asleep and I'm conducting the interview, I can't even imagine what my audience is feeling right now. And the issue with that is that the guest is only doing what you asked them to do. So inherently, I would say even before interrupting them, this was your fault. You didn't set expectations well with the question and what your expectation was. And this person feels like they're just trying to help. But as the interviewer, it would really help you to try and jump in at some point, if possible, recognize your mistake in the question that you asked and that this person is only trying to help you, and then try to find a way in that you could maybe ask a question and redirect the conversation. The nice thing about podcasting versus radio, Howard Stern is on the air and it's live. Whereas with a podcast, you do have the ability to go back and edit. You can also, so Neal, we're going to be working together. Let's say that happens, right? You ask someone a question, they go for 15 minutes. You're like, man, that was like way too much. One of the nice things is we're also going to deliver to you the transcript, and you can trim people's answers. So that is a separate beauty to the medium. So you can make that judgment call. Do I want to jump in, or hey, do I just want to make some adjustments later in post-production?
So follow-up question, if someone is going on for a long period of time, I jump in. We can fix that in post-production so that it's not completely awkward of like, hey, let me break in here. Let me steer you in a different direction. Then people are kind of talking over each other. That can be fixed. Yeah.
I mean, typically what I'll do with a podcast is I'm going to let the person speak. I'm not going to jump in, and then I will make those adjustments in post-production if I need to. If someone has a 17-minute answer, I would have my team create it as is, and then I would go back through and comb through the transcript and be like, hey, what of this am I going to cut out? And, maybe I do cut out quite a bit of it because it's just not relevant to the audience. And then what I try to do from there is learn from what was the question that I asked that led to a less than spectacular answer. And that's mostly where we hear that from our customers, that we see is when you try and ask these questions that are icebreaker questions to get the conversation going, and then you realize that you spent half your podcast on like where someone got their career started. For us, like in marketing, and they went to Virginia Tech and they went to the business school. And I'm like, I know I asked you this, and I know you care about this, but I don't know I don't know that this is providing that inherent value to the audience, that they are actually experiencing something from this. You use Howard Stern. I don't listen to Joe Rogan, but I have listened to Joe Rogan's interview with Mike Tyson because I love Mike Tyson. I found him fascinating as a human. And Mike Tyson did, I think, a 4-hour episode on Joe Rogan where, he's talking about his childhood, and I'm like, like I'm completely checked in, right? Like I want to know about Mike Tyson's childhood. No offense to you, Neal, and not that I don't want to know about your childhood, but usually on a podcast like this, people didn't tune in to hear about Neal's childhood. They tuned in to hear about, what Neal is experiencing from B2B podcasting. And so there's just a little bit of dichotomy, a little bit difference in who your guests are in a B2B podcast versus who your guests are in a celebrity entertainment based show.
I mean, this is a broad question, but just how do you prepare for a podcast?
Yeah, it really differs because I do a lot of different types of episodes. This one, for example, was relatively easy for me to prepare for.
Yeah.
And that's something that I've really learned over time I'm going to answer your question, but take it in maybe a little bit of a different direction. One of the things that I've really tried to learn how to prepare for a podcast is to try and make these things easier on myself. And so I've rolled out different styles of episodes that might be a little bit easier in nature for me to pull off, because when I do interview-based episodes, and my guess is that's where this conversation is stemming from, I do a lot of research on the person that's going to be interviewing me. I try to spend some time, especially if you think about this show, it's a show about B2B podcasting. So if I'm doing an interview, well, I want to go listen to their podcast, and a lot of times it's like 45 minutes to an hour. And if I want to go listen to 3 or 4 episodes, I mean, that's already 4 hours of me preparing for a show. And that isn't even me looking into their background or their company or anything along those lines. So what I've done is understanding that the interview model for me takes a long time, is I've tried to find other approaches to executing a podcast. So for example, I did a breakdown. So Motion owns and runs 6 shows right now, soon to be 8, that are our intellectual property. So I took one of them, Content Logistics, and I broke down 4 different episodes in the way that people talked about how you can turn your company into a media company using a podcast. And I actually recorded that this morning. And so I prepared that by going through transcripts, pulling segments, what have you, and then I just recorded myself and wrote short little blurbs of how I was going to introduce each segment. So trying to find different ways to make my life easier than always having to spend hours and hours breaking down an interview. And that's something that people typically evolve to. This is the 100th episode of this show. Before this show, I think we had 300 episodes on our previous show that we did. So, I've built to there, right? Like, it's not like I just, I didn't do 5 interviews and said, all right, I'm going to go do other stuff. I'd say probably the first 350 episodes I did were interview based. But what I found over time is after I did 350 interviews, I was like, all right, these take a lot of time to prepare for, and I want to find other ways to do this. And this episode is a good example where I said, hey, Neal, I'm going to give you the work. And just trying to find ways. Tristan and I did an episode. Tristan's my business partner and the co-founder of Motion and co-host of this show. We kind of alternate doing this. We did a show last week where we just had kind of a roundtable discussion, and that also made it a little bit easier for prep. So just trying to find ways to be respectful of your time. But yeah, my prep is pretty detailed, especially when I'm doing interview-based conversations, because I don't want to get smoked by someone who says something. And this did happen to me before. I brought someone on who's very well known, and I know of him and know about him very well. And I asked him, hey, so like one of the things I try to do is, just give a little blurb up front about who you are. Is there anything specific you wanted me to touch on? And he thought I didn't know anything about him. And he was like, well, why'd you bring me onto your show if you don't know anything about me? I was like, no, calm down. Like, I do, I promise. Here's the shows you work on. I've listened to some episodes, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, I try to make sure that people really feel like they were brought onto our show intentionally, not like I was just spamming a bunch of people with a certain background and saying, hey, are you willing to come on the show?
Yeah, got it. All right. So, one of the things that I would like to get to is, just providing value to listeners. And I think, a B2B podcast could be kind of dry if you don't manage it the right way. So I would love to really get my guests to a place where they're comfortable, where they feel like they can be somewhat vulnerable, and give real answers. If they're too robotic and they're just kind of giving the company line, whatever that might be, I think that might border on being a little bit boring. So how do you recommend kind of prying that out of them? How do you recommend getting them to a place where they're comfortable enough to be real people and give real answers?
Yeah. So for me, the way that this happened for me and I realized how to do this was to understand that you're not just setting out to have an interview with someone who has the right background, but that you really need to set out to have some topic, some theme, some premise, some problem that you're tackling with that person in the episode. So we'll use this show as an example, right? So my audience and my guests typically are people that play within the B2B podcasting space, and in lots of situations, it is B2B podcasters. When I bring someone onto this show, I don't just say in my head or on my piece of paper that I'm doing an interview with Neal Stewart, right? That is not what I'm setting out to do. I am doing an interview with Neal Stewart about how to launch a B2B podcast that is going to, help within a very niche industry, speaking, let's just use you as an example, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, so Neal is launching his podcast for his company Holland, and that podcast, here would be an example of an episode that I would do with Neal. How to have a podcast that speaks to two different audiences that is going to not only sell your service, but also help you to recruit the best and brightest talent in the world. That would be, someone outside of B2B podcasting would say that sounds boring. But the people within B2B podcasting, I promise you run into this all the time, which is, hey, I have this podcast. I want it to speak to an audience, but I have 3 different ideal customer profiles. How can I get it to speak to them? Or I want to use this for sales and to get people, to sell our company to potential employees. So I want to hear how Neal is doing that. And therefore, it's not me bringing Neal on and saying, all right, Neal, so tell us about your company. Tell us about your podcast. What's hard with podcasting? What's easy with podcasting? What tools are you using? What's your setup? No, I'm going to start with this interesting topic within the space. When it comes to a B2B podcast, you need to understand that if it's consumed by people outside of your space, it will be boring. If I go listen to a construction podcast and I don't work in construction, I don't think it's going to entertain me. But if you're tackling things on that podcast that matter to the people within your space, and you take a good angle and have a good premise, and you're tackling an actual problem, for me, the problem would be that people in B2B podcasting run into all the time is, I don't have the budget to launch 5 shows. I have 5 different audiences I need to speak to. How can my podcast speak to 5 different audiences? All of a sudden, I'm very interested in that episode. It's very interesting to me. And so the way I find to be interesting is to find problems within the space that other people are dealing with, and then narrowing in on how your guest can help to target that problem, not just an interview with a guest who has the right profile. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
That makes total sense. I mean, I compare it to creativity and brainstorming. Sometimes when you're brainstorming on a certain topic and you have no guardrails, it's actually harder to come up with a great concept. Whereas if you give yourself constraint and focus, it's actually easier to brainstorm. I always use an example of, like, when people ask me, well, what kind of music do you like? Wow, like that's like the hardest question to answer, because I think about all the different genres of music that I like, and it's hard for me to come up with like one band that I love. Where if like someone said, well, who's your favorite indie rock musician? Like, okay, you've narrowed it down to a certain genre. Now I don't have to think in such an expansive way. I can get to an answer faster. Does that make sense? Is it kind of the same concept?
Yeah, it's in journalism, they call it the inverted pyramid, which is that you start in very narrow and then you're able to work your way into more broad conversation. So I use that topic or that idea of like asking someone about their background. I want to tell the audience as well that I love to talk about people's background. And you know where I usually land on that topic is like around the 30 to 40 minute mark. I jumped in with a very hard hitting topic, problem, what have you, within the space that people are dealing with. Okay, and then they're hooked. They're like, okay, this is interesting. Neal's talking about how he was able to launch a podcast for multiple audiences all under one roof, because that's very challenging. And now we've talked about that for 20 minutes, 30 minutes. The audience kind of gets it. And at that point, I can kind of broaden out and be like, so, all right, so that's what you're working on now. Like, how did you wind up at Holland and decide that you wanted to do podcasting? Okay, great. So before Holland, what were you up to? And like, what led you to the place you are now? I work my way back and out of that story versus starting there and saying, all right, audience, Neal has given you nothing to this point. And sorry to keep using you as the example.
You're good.
That's what we're doing, I guess, today. I know Neal has provided no value to you. You don't know who he is. You've never heard of his show. You're not in construction, but you're going to sit here for the next 10 minutes. You're going to hear all about Neal versus I bring Neal in. Neal says, hey, here's this problem that you're dealing with that I dealt with, and here's how I solved it. Now you've caught my attention. Now I'm like, okay, Neal, where the heck are you from? Like, how did you come to these, conclusions? How did you figure this out? I'm now checked in. I'm now interested in you as a person because you've given me value as to why I should care about you. And now you and I can kind of have a free-flowing conversation really about whatever the heck we want. And that's where I start to have some fun and get more broad. But starting very narrow, I think, brings the audience in early and makes them care about the content.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Yeah. So, in that kind of direction, how do you prepare your guests in advance of the podcast? Do you give them the questions up front? Do you spring questions on them? Because I could see a situation where you're interviewing someone and you don't ask the question of, well, tell me about your background first. And they're like, whoa, wait a minute here. Like, wow, we jumped into that quick. So if they're not prepared for that, maybe they will react in an adverse kind of way.
Yeah. Great point. So one of the things is funny you bring that up. And by the way, I just want to say I love that you brought up the music thing. I'm gonna definitely use that in either a LinkedIn post or something because it's like the worst. It's the worst question on earth. And I never thought of it that way. I love that analogy. So sorry to go on a tangent, but to answer your question, I had this approach. It was three layers, right? So I started for a long time. I asked tell me about your background thing, and I hated that over time. And so I was like, all right, how are we going to pivot this? So then what I started doing is I was like, hey, I'm going to record afterward an intro based on what we talk about on the podcast. And I decided against that over time for two reasons. One, that time that I told you that I got reamed out by that guy, it was because I said I was going to do that, and he thought I didn't know who he was, and so I was making him give me like his background before we started. I was like, hey, like tell me, I'm going to record this afterward, but like tell me about yourself as well. I can incorporate that. And so that didn't work out. But the other thing that it added for me was a dependency, which was after and you're going to learn this, Neal, after doing a podcast, you feel like you ran a marathon. It takes a lot of energy just to get on and perform. Basically is what you're doing. It's what we're doing right now. And I realized that I hated the fact that after a podcast interview, I had to go record again. I had to go write my intro to the podcast. I had to kind of digest everything that just happened and write another thing, hit record again. And I hated that dependency. That was just like, it was too much for me mentally to think I just finished, but now I got to go do a thing again right now or it's not done. So I've changed to what I did today, which is that I tell the guest before I start, I'm like, hey, look, so here's how this is going to work. I'm going, and that's how I set the expectation. And I'm going to answer your question in a different way in a second. But the way that I do it right now is I'm like, hey, here's how this is going to work. You're going to jump on. I'm going to intro you. I'm going to talk for a little bit. I'm going to talk about what the episode is going to be about. I'm going to talk a little bit about your background. And then this is where I set the expectation. I'm like, we're going to jump right into it. So I'm going to say, welcome to the show. You're going to say, thanks for having me. And I'm going to ask you the big topic. Now, where that topic derives from, I've usually run by this person to an extent. I don't run my questions by my guests. In total transparency, a lot of times it's because I'm extremely busy and those questions get developed like the day before or the morning of my podcast interview. I'm doing my research, my homework, taking notes, getting ready, what have you. But a lot of times I don't have them. I run a weekly show, I run another podcast, and then I run 6 other podcasts for my company. So I don't have the time to say, hey, I wish I could. I wish I could send people all the questions 2 weeks in advance and have them QA them and come back and we can have a big brainstorm. But a lot of times when you're doing a B2B podcast, time isn't necessarily your friend. And so you have to just operate within what you can. So with that, a lot of times I don't know the topic that I want to tackle with the guest. And I'll use an example from yesterday. I'm interviewing this woman who runs a podcast at her company. I know she's a B2B podcaster. I know she's doing it herself. And I don't always know the angle, right? Like a lot of these people, they're working behind the scenes or they're just head down, whatever, they have their podcast, but I don't know like that specific angle. Like, Neal, if I didn't know you, I wouldn't know that the angle we could take on a podcast episode would be how to speak to multiple audiences with one podcast, right? You're a customer, so I help you to come up with the strategy of the show. But in most cases, if I'm just interviewing any B2B podcaster out there in the world, I don't know the intricacies behind their show and how they can provide value to my audience other than that they do the work. So I had this conversation yesterday, and I asked the question that I love asking, and I encourage you and anyone out there to ask, which is when you get on with a potential guest, I say, hey, I know you're in the space. I know you're probably a fit for the show. I don't know exactly where you fit or what the premise of the episode is going to be. So here's my audience, B2B podcasters, who are interested in podcasting or currently podcasting. And how do you think that you could help my audience? And she and I had a back and forth and a good conversation, and she recommended some ideas of which I wouldn't have known, and we landed on a really interesting topic. And that only happened because I said, hey, look, I don't know everything. I don't know everything about you. I'd love for you to help me. So that way, when we get on the episode and then I go and do my intro of her, she's going to know what's coming. She may not know the exact questions, but she's helped me to brainstorm the topic. We had a nice conversation about it, and she knows basically, for the most part, the 30-minute conversation that we had is what she's going to bring to the conversation. There shouldn't be too many surprises. Now, you won't always get the chance to have a pre-conversation. I interviewed Gary Vee. There's no way on earth. I mean, he gave me 20 minutes to interview him, and there's no way on earth I'm going to say, hey, Gary, you want to jump on a pre-call for 30 minutes? And what do you think you could provide to my audience? He's going to be like, are you like, this was supposed to be the interview, dude? Like, now you're not getting the interview. So, you have to take each situation, as it comes. But that question of, here's who my audience is. I'd love to have you on, flatter them a little bit so they don't think that you don't know what you're talking about. I'd love to have you on. But, how do you think you could help this audience? And most people who are worthy of coming on your podcast that you've identified for one reason or another, they've got their shtick or the thing that they're good at or the thing that they're passionate about, and that's what they're going to say. And you may or may not know that up front.
So what percentage of your questions do you script out? Like, I ask the opposite way. What percentage of your questions are improv, where you give yourself the leeway to say, all right, I'm going to build off of that answer that person just gave?
Yeah. I mean, I think like 75% of my questions are scripted, and I think that is because I come in with a topic. I think if and when I used to have much more of a broad show, I would be trying to spend the episode trying to figure out what direction I want to go, right? I'm like, all right, I'm interviewing. And back in the day, it was like interviewing VPs of marketing and CMOs. And I'm asking them like pretty standardized set of questions. And I'm like waiting for them to say something interesting that I can then like take the podcast episode in that direction. And things were like very off the cuff because I'm trying to figure out how I can make this interesting because I didn't come in with a very detailed premise. And now with having a very detailed premise and a problem that I want to tackle, I really do feel like in kind of that journalistic approach, I do have my questions that I'm pretty interested in getting answers to that I hope will have pretty detailed answers to. And I do stick to my script a lot or my scripted questions, I guess. Now, where I've really evolved over the years has been my ability to expand on what my guests said or how they answered. I think that is something that took me a long time to go from like question, thanks for coming, and this was another episode of recorded content, to question, guest has answer, and then Justin is like, love that answer. Now I'm going to give my opinion on the exact same thing, but how I've seen it with all the shows that I work on, blah, blah, blah. And then I go for another 3 to 4 minutes. And then I'm able to then transition that into either a follow-up question, which I do. I said 75%, maybe it's 60%. That would leave for 40%, 25%, whatever it may be, of me asking, a question off the cuff. But a lot of times it's like they go, I go, maybe I just stop and I don't even ask a question after I give my opinion. And then a lot of times there's this really good transition of like, I didn't even ask anything, but I then gave my opinion on something and it got their, mind racing on the topic even more. And then they have it's not even a like question, answer. It's more turns into conversation, which I think you want.
Yeah.
But then I typically do steer it back towards my premise, and I find that the episodes are more interesting that way. It's like, okay, great. Like we just had a great back and forth. Now let's get back on topic. Like I have you here for a reason. We are not here necessarily to be like two people who are having coffee or a beer or something and the audience gets to be a fly on the wall. I found that was very challenging for me to just say like, hey, let's just cut it up and just see where this goes. And that I didn't feel made great content.
Well, yeah, one of my fears is not be asking direct questions. I think that, and I'm kind of doing it here, like it's taken me a minute to get into the question. And if it takes me 3 minutes to ask a question, I think people are tuning out. So one of the things I want to kind of practice is the art of interviewing and just getting to the question and asking it. So is there any kind of training that you've gone through, or is there a process that you use to be more precise with how you ask the question?
Yeah, so typically what I've tried to do, and the way I try to set up my question is if I want to give context, I try to give the context up front and then end my my sentence, my speaking with my question. And the reason that you do that is really twofold. It helps you to steer away from double-barreled questions, which a double-barreled question is like, so Neal, I know you're launching your podcast at Holland, so, I'm curious what led you to start your podcast. The reason I ask is X, Y, and Z. So I'm wondering, like, what do you see for the podcast for the future? Well, I just asked you two completely different questions filled within one soundbite. So that's confusing for you, and you're like, but which one am I supposed to answer? And I don't even remember what the first one was, but maybe that was the better one. I don't know. But also it helps it helps the guest, and it helps for a better answer. It also helps for the cut. And what I mean by that is we're going to be creating a bunch of repurposed content. So I encourage my interviewers to be able to speak their minds, to be able to give context before a question. You do not have to be there as like a Q&A, like I'm here to just ask you a question. But if you lay it out, and I'll give an example. It's like, so I know you're going to launch your podcast in the next 1 to 2 months. It can be very daunting to launch a podcast. I'm sure you've gone through a lot. But at the end of the day, there may be one thing that's standing out in your mind. What is that one thing that's standing out in your mind that has you most nervous about your podcast? Boom, that question now we can use in a clip or a promo video. We can cut all of my background, but that question, boom, is right there. And then you as the guest will answer, and we can cut that into a video. So there's kind of two reasons why that approach works well. The first is, it's okay to give context. Just be careful about how you're doing it. And so I do take kind of that formulaic approach, which is like, say as much as you want. So I disagree with you a little bit on, if you speak for too long, it may make it boring. I think as long as you're providing good context, but it's just the way that you set it up. So it's very formulaic. It's like, say as much as you want, like infinity, right? Like it's your podcast, do whatever you want, but try and end it in a question, and try not to ask questions as you go through whatever it is that you're saying. Just say what you want to say and then end it with a question. It's going to help both your guest in the way that they answer, as well as anything that you create out of it.
Yeah, that makes total sense. All right. So I think this is an interesting question, but I also feel like just doing this podcast right now, I'm kind of answering it for myself. But I've noticed that in a lot of your podcasts that Motion produces, people are standing up it looks like at least, when they're recording the podcast. Is there a reason for that?
No. Which podcasts are people standing? Or is it just the way we cut it?
I don't know. It could be. I mean, I guess maybe it could look like I'm standing up right now. Maybe it's just people practicing good posture.
Yeah.
But as I was watching it a couple days ago, kind of getting prepared for this, I was like, it looks like they're standing up. It looks like they're standing up. And I think maybe the reason why it makes sense. I mean, I'm kind of a fidgety person. So as we're recording this, I'm trying to hold still.
Yeah.
And it's hard. Like, I'm trying to kind of keep my head in a similar position. I'm trying not to shift around too much. And I think that maybe standing up would minimize that somewhat, because like
I do not stand up. So
no, I don't. You don't. Yeah.
No,
but
no.
It looks like other people do.
Yeah. For me personally, like I said, when I get done with a podcast, I'm exhausted for a variety of reasons. One of them being that I'm also a fidgety person, and I got to sit here and, remain pretty well within my spot, trying to sit up with nice posture. As anyone who works in front of a computer all day, probably don't have as good of posture as I would like. And right now, like sitting up, straight back, what have you. But yeah, I mean, for me, it's all about what you're going to get out of the final product in terms of quality. And so, it's part of the just the endeavor is, got to sit there and look good for the camera.
Yeah.
Whether you want to do that standing or sitting, I think is very much your prerogative. I know there's a very famous sports podcaster, Pat McAfee, former punter. Yep. He stands during his podcast and yells into the mic, and that's his thing. So with a lot of this, you're the creative director of your own show. You're going to find the things you like doing. If you like standing for the way that it looks or for the way that it feels, that's your choice. And so those are things you'll have to play with.
I think I'm going to experiment with the standing, because like just sitting here holding still, I got to just like loosen up and fidget for a minute here. It's not I think
environment
easy.
Too, what looks best on camera within your environment. If you can have that set up, then more power to you.
The pre-reads. So you open the show with kind of a pre-read section. How do you train someone you came from a radio background? How do you train someone who doesn't have a radio background to do that in an effective way?
Yeah, just practice makes perfect. Just work on it. At this point, I can say, hello and welcome to another episode of Recorded Content. This episode is brought to you by Motion, a B2B podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers, blah, blah, blah. I've done it so many times that it's off the tip of my tongue. Having it there in front of you, I think it's okay to be reading off of something or what have you. But just practicing and trying to make it organic. And another thing, when you do anything like this, smile. It helps a lot. It was something that I learned, actually not from my radio days. So just my background a little bit. I started in radio, realized that they don't make any money, and then was like, okay, unless you're like in the top 0.1%, sure, like Howard Stern made $1 gazillion, but there are not a lot of Howard Sterns out there. I had a buddy who worked at the radio station that I wanted to get a job at. He had worked there for 3 years and was making $8 an hour for the 4-hour show that he was on, and then went from the radio station to the Marriott to park cars. And I was like, this is not what I want to do for the next 3 to indefinite years. So I left the radio world and I just took a job in sales, right? I was like, all right, I'm going to go be a business person, I guess. And so I took a job in sales. And so one of the things in sales that one of my first managers taught me was in the medium of being, and we were over the phone at that time, there wasn't really Zoom. I was making cold calls, and was, if you have a straight face, over the phone, you sound like you're frowning. Mm-hmm. If you are smiling, you sound like you have a straight face. And if you are actively laughing and like jubilant over the phone, that is what simply makes you sound like you have a smile on and you're enjoying your day. You don't sound as ridiculous as you may look or feel. And so I'll just give an example here, which is straight face. Hey, this is Justin Brown. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. I mean, there's not a lot of energy there. I got a straight face. I did my read. Now I'm going to do it while like almost laughing and just being what feels ridiculous but probably doesn't look that way. Hey, this is Justin Brown. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. I'm like almost laughing. I have a huge smile on my face, and that comes through the mic. So my biggest recommendation for anyone bringing in an episode, put a big old fat smile on your face, get to the point where you're almost laughing at yourself, and it's just going to come off with very positive, warm energy for your audience. That is above, memorizing it or having an amazing ad read. That's my biggest recommendation for people. Come out of the gates for the audience as someone that they're excited to hear from.
Yep. Yeah, you almost have to be a caricature of yourself.
Yeah, and it does. The thing is the only person that it feels that way to is you.
Yeah. Right?
Like, it doesn't feel that way to the audience when you put this, and I think it's true for like people who are on television and any kind of performer, dancers, what have you, is like you have to put this like big smile on your face that feels silly for you, but for the audience, you just come off warm. And understanding how to balance that has been something that's helped me a lot in my entire career. I really try, even on my worst days, if it's a sales call that I'm conducting for someone who wants to use our service or what have you, just put on, a big smile that seems ridiculous, but for me, it's always kind of drawn people to me and helped me a lot. And it can be challenging at times, but, if it wasn't challenging, everybody would do it, kind of thing.
Yep. Yeah, great advice. Let's talk about someone's first episode. I think there are a few ways to approach this because there's a little bit of you're building the plane as you fly it. You're not going to go into a first episode and look back at it after your 50th episode and say, oh, wow, we really nailed it on that first one. There's always going to be an evolution. So when you're thinking about your guest, and this is kind of specific to us, our first guest could be the founder of our company, and that's going to be great content. He's going to give us a great interview. He's a really interesting person, been in the business for a long time. But there's also part of me where I'm like, you know what? I don't know if I want to have him on as my first guest because I'm always going to look back at that first episode and say, I wish I could do it better. So What would you recommend? Would you recommend coming out flying with that really awesome guest? Or would you ease your way into it with a guest that, maybe, I don't know, gives you other benefits that are different than the great content? Maybe they're a more personable person or you're not going to value that episode as much later on.
Yeah, tons of ways to answer this question. But I will start with what you said, which is episode 1, episode 20, episode 50. You will evolve as a host. And so, I used the Gary Vee example. I've had a relationship with Gary Vee for about 5 years, and I knew that I wasn't going to get him right away because I wanted to get more comfortable. Like, I could have at any time, and I wanted to keep that in my pocket because I wanted to make sure I was at my best. When I brought him on, I wanted to make sure that, I was very comfortable with the medium before I did. With that said, that was that situation, and your situation is your situation. So that's just me to say, I agree that can be a concern. Now, in your situation, things don't need to be necessarily as chronological as you may think that they need to be. And what I mean by that is that most of our customers launch their show with 3 to 5 episodes. So if that is something that you're concerned about, and I totally understand if I was interviewing the CEO of my company and, I'd never done this before, and they're probably just knowing this medium, already going to scrutinize it, right? Like, I see it everywhere where CEOs are like, okay, marketing wants to do a podcast. They don't know much about the medium. So they're like, all right, I guess we're going to see what this is. And then you're in your seat and you're like, okay, so this is my first opportunity to show this to the people who sign the checks. And it's the one I'm going to be the most nervous about ever because I've never done it before. Understand that if you launch with 3 to 5 episodes, that first episode that you release does not need to be the first episode that you record. So maybe you go get your feet wet with a guest or two and then interview your CEO third. We can still launch the CEO episode as episode 1, or what we've seen a lot of times like episode 0, like the this is what this podcast is about episode. But it doesn't have to be, even though that's going to be what the release schedule is, it doesn't need to be the order in which it's recorded. So that way you could get a little bit of, your footing before saying, all right, CEO, let's see where you're putting your dollars.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a great idea. That's a really smart approach. My concern isn't so much of how I show up in that piece of content in the eyes of the CEO. It's more that I don't want to burn great content early on when I'm still kind of getting my legs underneath me and and perform poorly as an interviewer. So
here's something you may not have thought of. Your CEO doesn't have to come on once. You can have the CEO on for episode 1 or episode 3, and then you can bring the CEO back for episode 10 and 12 and whatever you want. We've seen some of our customers have done, their CEO corner, and they do it once a quarter where the CEO comes on and they interview him about different topics or what have you. So I don't think that ever you need to worry about like, this is my one chance. I mean, unless, again, using big names, like it's just a good example, the Gary Vee episode. And I know he's not going to come back. I know I had my one chance with him, and that's why I waited. But for you with the CEO, like, there's no reason that your CEO has to only have one episode as the first episode ever, and then see you later. He's never coming back on the podcast.
Yeah. Cool. Great ideas. So I like the CEO corner. That's interesting, which is a nice segue to the next question. How do you brainstorm segments of a podcast? I mean, we went through our strategic plan yesterday, and it was kind of like, all right, there's an opening, there's the interview, there's the closing, which certainly could be the format, but there's also other ideas out there like a CEO corner, or David Letterman's top 10 list was like a kind of a segment. Like I've seen podcasts kind of integrate ideas like that. First of all, I guess a double-barreled question, maybe somewhat related, but do you like that approach of having segments to kind of keep it fresh? And if you do, how do you brainstorm that to make sure that it's integrated?
Yeah, so I love just different approaches. I won't call them necessarily segments because I just do all sorts of different stuff. But I'm going to take a step back from that. So I'm going to say that I love it, and then I'm going to say I don't think that you need to do that right now, and I'll give you my reason why, which is you learn how to do these things through time and experience. I did 200 plus episodes before I ever tried to do a different kind of episode. I'm not saying you do that. The medium was a lot different at those times. And I think people are experimenting with things, but I also watch people overcomplicate their podcast incredibly. And all that does, it's hard enough if you do a very simple approach to your show. Call it interview based, call it speaking, solo to camera. Still, the vast majority of shows fail. And I watch people really, really try to overcomplicate things out of the gates. Hey, we're going to do it this way. We're going to come in and there's going to be this like crazy kitschy opening and we're going to have like this segment up front and then we're going to close it with, a top 10. I'm just using this as the example, a top 10 segment on the back, at the end of the episode, or a quick hitter segment or what have you. And they get through 3 episodes and they are like, I'm exhausted. This is taking so much energy and thought. And for me, I now do like 4 or 5 different types of episodes, but because I've taken my time to bolt them on and they've been very intentional as things I actually want to do, not forced, like excitement of the show, like, oh, we need to do something. Instead, I'm like, hey, I want to do something. And then I bolt that on because it's something that I feel my audience needs or is lacking or that I can provide versus like this show, like what we're doing today. This came out of a thing. I was like, I'm at the 100th episode. So what can I do that's a little bit different for the 100th episode where I can take some of the knowledge that I feel like I've gained over X number of years and impart that to the audience? And then I sat there and I had a brainstorm because it was around an idea. I didn't say, hey, Tristan, we need to do something remarkable or different or what. It was like, hey, we have a situation, which is that we're at our 100th episode and we want to do something around that. And what can we do that's a little bit different? And the same thing has happened. I told you I did the breakdown of one of our shows. I was like, hey, we have these 6 shows. How can we incorporate them into our podcast? Or, hey, we're creating tons of amazing written content in our company. How can we take that written content and turn it into scripts and do solo episodes? What if we do that? But it didn't generate from 2 people getting in a room and saying, we got to get creative. I think that there's that balance of like, what are you getting creative for? And I hear it constantly, which is like, B2B is boring and we need to do something exciting. And I just disagree with that premise. I think it all revolves around what is something interesting that you can provide to your audience and what are the ways that you can do that. So I think it's just the balance of not doing something, some segment or some style for the sake of doing it, but that you feel like it's intentional and has value. And I would argue that, Neal, the only way you're going to learn what you want to put into an episode as a segment or a style or a new structure or what have you is from doing it. You're going to do it. You're going to be like, hey, here's where I actually think that we can do something interesting versus just getting in a room, never having had podcasted before and saying like, all right, we've never done this before. Now let's get super creative. And it's like, okay, I mean, good luck. There's people out there who've been doing this for a long time and they're trying to get creative. And, I think I brought this up to you or maybe I didn't, but there's a very famous podcast, Pardon My Take. It's the #1 sports podcast in the world. And when they were interviewed about what the difference was, and they do all sorts of segments, interviews, do crazy stuff on that show. And one of the hosts said, our biggest differentiator over time has been consistency. That's it. We have a show 3 days a week, and we're always there for you. We don't miss. I mean, barring a national disaster, we don't miss episodes. We don't miss episodes for holidays. We don't miss that. I'm not saying that people do this. This is a B2B podcast. They, they're paid podcasters to do that professionally. But just consistency. And when you start to set up barriers for yourself with like, we got to do this and that and this and that and this and that. And then every episode, like I told you on this episode, just recording an intro for me became too much. And I didn't want to do that anymore. Having to add more work to getting an episode done. It's hard enough to do one episode, but then to set more things that are in your way from saying it's done. I caution anyone early on doing that because it's hard enough to just do an episode where you're having a conversation and do that consistently, and then you add in additional things. It can just make your life very difficult.
Yeah. Great advice.
But I don't want to say that I don't think people should get creative. I just think that it should come from places of need, desire, experience than let's get creative for the sake of getting creative.
Yeah. I'd also throw in maybe feedback from your audience.
Absolutely.
Yeah, if you're hearing from your audience that, hey, I love your podcast. I'd love it if you included this. Okay, well, there's an idea. I mean, it's kind of basic marketing 101, have insights on your audience or your consumers or whatever it might be.
All right, Neal, I think we got one more.
Yeah.
So choose wisely.
Yeah, well, I only have one more. So let's talk about KPIs and kind of metrics for measuring the effectiveness of the podcast. I know that you've talked about this quite a few times, like it's not about really the number of downloads or listens that you get, especially in a B2B format. I had an experience last week, I guess, where we sent out a newsletter and I got feedback that one perfect person read our newsletter. And I was stoked about that. Like just one, like it got to the right person and that made that project, that initiative worth it even when it reached one person. So I kind of think of the podcast as the same way. If it gets to the right people, that's what it's all about. So what do you recommend in terms of trying to measure that for the sake of making sure that the podcast is viewed internally, that there's momentum behind it and that there's purpose behind the investment? Yeah.
So there's a lot of ways to answer this question. So I'm going to start with the way to answer this question from a B2B marketing standpoint. Is my opinion on the way that your show should be used is as an extension of the content marketing team. So if you look at your investment into your podcast, is that investment, what you're getting out of that investment from a content marketing standpoint, worth it? So out of every episode, Neal, you're going to get 4 videos across different styles. You're going to get a video for YouTube. That's going to live on YouTube. So, what would be the investment you would want to put into a YouTube channel? Now you have content for your YouTube channel. You're going to have multiple videos that you can use on social. You're going to have written content that you can have on a landing page and corresponding video content that's also going to be on that landing page. You're also going to have audio that's now living in a new medium of Apple Podcasts, Spotify, what have you. You're going to have image-based content that's going to be able to live on those landing pages or stand alone on social media. So there's really a lot there. So if I'm in marketing and on the content marketing team, I'm looking at what would this compete with in my content marketing budget. So you have to have this desire for content being a difference maker within your organization first and foremost. If you're just looking for how many people filled out a form, well, then maybe don't put your money into content marketing, put it into pay-per-click or something along those lines. Now, that said, I think there's two pieces when it comes to the download component or the actual consumption of the show. A lot of times, a lot of our customers are more niche in nature, and if they can have 25, 50, 100 people who are the right people that would buy from them, listen to them for an hour every week or 2 weeks or once a month, that is a huge win for them. The other thing I would say is there's a huge misconception when it comes to downloads of podcast as to what's good. I believe 100 downloads in your first 7 days of release would put you in the top 25% of podcasts in the world. So there is not only understanding what these metrics mean, it's understanding the value of a listen. It's understanding that you're not only going to be where people would download, you're also going to be on YouTube where there's going to be streams. You're also going to be on social media and getting views and engagements and comments all over social media. But then it's also, understanding the sheer quantity of quality content that you're going to get from this. So that's my, look, we could do a whole podcast on KPIs for podcasting, but at a high level, I would say make sure you understand what podcast downloads are and what good qualifies as, and then really understand what are you trying to get out of this. Is this a push for you to just have an audio show that people are going to listen to in Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or is your podcast really an extension of what you're doing from a content standpoint? And that's typically where our customers lean.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, I think of it as a very viable and important piece of the total ecosystem that I'm trying to create. And every platform is part of that ecosystem, and it starts to feed itself. And when it does that, when I can look at my monthly social media calendar and I can say, I'm producing a podcast and I'm going to get 10 pieces of content out of that, and I really only need to fill up about 20 days of content on LinkedIn, which is our main, social media platform, I've already done a big chunk of my job in that realm. And now I only have to fill in a few other cracks. So that's the way that I view it. And yeah, I think looking at all of those different metrics of engagement, views, likes, I would probably also look at like total number. I don't know if we can do this, but like total number of minutes of engagement. So when I'm trying to reach one person, when you say, all right, well, I had one click on that or one view, that doesn't feel too impressive. But if you think of like that one person who's the right person and they engage with your content for 30 minutes, that just by itself is a lot more compelling.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's what I ask people a lot of times. I'm like, what would you give to have someone listen to you talk for an hour? What's that worth to you in dollars? And then you also have the aspect of reaching out to people and people you want to talk to one-on-one. Let's say you bring someone on your podcast who's an ideal customer and someone you want to work with. How much would you pay for an hour-long meeting with that person? It's an interesting component of it. There's lots of ways to dice it up. So, all right, Neal.
Awesome.
Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for coming on with me today. I really appreciate you coming on Recorded Content, and I'm excited to get your show launched.
Yeah, really looking forward to it. Thanks for letting me do this. This was good practice for my upcoming show.
Yeah, you got to ask questions. There you go. Yeah. You're ready for the CEO.
I'm ready.
Thanks for listening to Recorded Content, a show brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcasting agency for B2B tech marketers. We do the podcast stuff so you can focus on strategy, building brand awareness, and developing new relationships. To learn more about how you can launch and grow a podcast for your company, check out motionagency.io. Thanks for listening to Recorded Content.